Hi there. It's been a while since I've made a YouTube video, but this has long been the style of video that I want to produce. This kind of long-form video essay, especially about linguistics. I have a deep passion for linguistics and the study of languages and how they work. Some of the languages that have fascinated me recently include Cantonese, Cebuano, and Javanese, which themselves are not nationally recognized languages, but have millions of speakers, especially across diaspora, and still are recognized as languages of importance. That being said, studying abroad here in Taiwan these last 5 weeks, I found a rather striking lack of resources for the Taiwanese language, Taigi. Taiwan is one of the most linguistically diverse places on the planet, especially when you consider its area. There are 16 indigenous Austronesian languages recognized by the Ministry of Education in Taiwan, spanning 9 different Austronesian language families. There are likely many more unrecognized indigenous languages. Moreover, there are 3 varieties of Chinese on the island. You have Mandarin Guoyu, you have Taiwanese Taigi, and you have Hakka. And so, what made Taiwanese's lack of resources striking to me is that there are so many speakers of Taiwanese, but the bookshelves aren't lined with Taiwanese materials like Learn Taiwanese Easy, like you see for languages like Mandarin. In this video, I'll discuss how social movements, and from the 1890s onward, affect and continue to influence the development of Taigi. I'll also discuss how the language was maintained during these periods in which Taigi was effectively banned from public spaces. Before any of that, though, I need to explain why I'm choosing to call Taiwanese Hokkien Taigi instead of Taiwanese Hokkien, which is more linguistically accepted, and Southern Min, which has been used historically. The distinction between a language and a dialect is rarely a clear one. English and German, despite being from the same language family, are completely mutually unintelligible, so it's a no-brainer that they'd be separate languages, right? And yet, Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, commonly accepted as separate languages, are actually about 40 to 60% mutually intelligible. There have been all sorts of videos and papers exploring the relationship between those 3 Scandinavian languages. Farsi, Dari, and Tajik are actually all linguistically accepted as dialects of the same language, but politically recognized as 3 different languages. Moreover, some dialects of Arabic are actually mutually unintelligible. For example, the dialects native to Morocco are actually mutually unintelligible with the dialects native to the Levant. It's no surprise that what constitutes a language is largely in an ethnopolitical identity framework. That is to say, it's usually for the purpose of maintaining a shared or perhaps separate identity. Taigi is a Southern Min language, which is derived from the Old Chinese language spoken during the Shang and Zhou dynasty. Taigi's closest relative is Hokkien, which is spoken in the Fujian province in China. Many loanwords and a couple hundred years of linguistic isolation have led to many terms being different in the 2 languages, even though they're still largely mutually intelligible. As one researcher put it, a Hokkien speaker probably could not understand a Taiwanese lecture on motorcycle engineering. For the purpose of analyzing Taigi itself, I'll be analyzing it as its own language under its own political influences, separate from Hokkien and the Amoy dialect, which is largely considered the prestige dialect. But I also reject the direct translation of Taiwanese, because it's unfair to the linguistic diversity of Taiwan. Like I said, there are so many languages across the island, and to call Taigi Taiwanese in English is almost to suggest that it is the sole language of Taiwan. It's almost like saying to a 10th generation Texan who's only ever spoken Spanish, "We're in America, speak American." Even though in Taigi, the word Taigi has no such connotation of being the sole language of Taiwan, in English to call it the Taiwanese language, I think does minimize the linguistic roles of other languages in Taiwan. Now, with that out of the way, let's briefly talk about the pre-Japanese history of the Taiwanese language. Before there were any Chinese people living in Taiwan, the indigenous Austronesian people had already been there for about 4,000 years. Indeed, they're still around, and there's about 200,000 of them recognized in Taiwan. They had no written language, so their history wasn't recorded. The Dutch and the Spanish first set up shops on the southern and northern sides of the island, respectively, until they were driven out by Ming loyalist Koxinga, or in Taigi, Ding Sen Gong. He brought with him some of the earliest settlers from China. After the Qing conquered Taiwan in 1662, Chinese people from Fujian began immigrating en masse, settling on the western side of the island and Sinicizing the plains indigenous people. The rest were largely driven out to the mountains. These people would go on to be known as the Hokkien people, although the etymology is a little unclear. These people mostly spoke Hokkien, which itself is a southern Min language native to Fujian. Indeed, this is the origin for Taigi. The Qing dynasty largely let Taiwan manage itself. This included linguistically, so even though Guanyu, or official speak, was the lingua franca for the mainland of China, it largely didn't promulgate in Taiwanese minds. No language policy was ever carried out by the Qing dynasty. In 1895, the Qing dynasty handed over control of the island of Taiwan to the Japanese after the First Sino-Japanese War. The speakers of Taigi were then ruled by the Japanese from 1895 to 1945. The Japanese wanted to integrate Taiwan and its people into the newfound Japanese empire. This involved forced Japanese education, Japanese print publications like newspapers, and Japanese broadcasts like radio, and forcing that onto the people of Taiwan. By 1945, when the island was handed over to the Republic of China, 40% of Taiwan could speak Japanese. As a result, the Japanese language heavily influenced Taigi during this period. Sino-Japanese loanwords, which came from the Chinese of the Han Dynasty into Japanese, were then loaned into Taigi to fill existing lexical gaps. For example, words like hospital, bangin, baseball, yakyu, and bathroom, yansol. Moreover, Taigi speakers borrowed Japanese turns of phrases and grammatical particles, or at least were influenced by them. For example, the Japanese question particle, ga, was loaned into Taigi and influenced the modern Taigi grammatical particle, gam, which is also used to form a question. Meanwhile, the Taiwanese people pushed to maintain their culture with the creation of social movements and organizations like the Taiwan People's Party and the Taiwan Cultural Association. Social movements like these sought to preserve Taiwan's culture, but they were suppressed by Japanese rule, as it was antithetical to their colonization efforts. When Taiwan was handed over to the Republic of China in 1945, tensions began brewing almost immediately. Over 1 million KMT loyalists and refugees fleeing the Chinese Civil War moved into Taiwan. Most of them could not speak Taigi, and the Hokkien people overwhelmingly could not speak Mandarin. Immediately, Taiwanese people began to push for independence for the island entirely. In 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang government declared martial law after completely retreating from the Chinese mainland. The KMT led a violent suppression of political oppression from 1949 until 1987 that is now remembered as the White Terror, or in Taigi, Pe Sek Yong Po. During the White Terror period, the Taiwanese language was outlawed. Mandarin was the official language of the Republic of China, and children were punished for speaking Taiwanese in schools. Japanese was also banned, and its speakers in Taiwan were persecuted too. Almost overnight, the linguistic situation on the island completely flipped on its head. Even though the use of Taigi was effectively banned, its speakers continued to maintain their language. Taiwanese print newspapers continued to print new issues in both Chinese characters, Hanji, and Beoiji, a romanized version of Taigi made by Christian missionaries during the 19th century.
In a period otherwise characterized by media censorship from the government, this was also a period which saw the rise of the golden age of Taigi films, termed Taigi Pian, from the Mandarin word for Taigi films, or in Taigi, Taigi Pian. These films went through several layers of government screening and censorship and were required to have English and Mandarin subtitles, but they were still primarily produced with Taigi dialogue, 即汉书, in Chapter 1 of Taiwanese Language Cinema. Describes the period between the KMT takeover in 1945 and the 228 incident in 1947 as a vacuum in which a lot of uncensored left-wing Taigi films were produced. Su describes how from 1947 to 1958, government censorship mostly focused on the news, and cinema was allowed to be produced so long as it did not challenge the dominant ideology. Then KMT cultural regulation largely came after 1958 Joint Communique and the 1962 changes to the censorship form, and then finally the 1967 establishment of the Cultural Department at the Ministry of Education. However, Su describes how many Taigi films are overinterpreted. He describes the 1961, quote, Fantasy of the Deer Warrior film, which director Zhang Ying described as just a children's film. Su implies that many Taigi filmmakers were made political prisoners during the White Terror period as a result. It was also during this period that the linguistically vague term Southern Min was ascribed to Taigi by the KMT. This was an attempt to denativize and de-Taiwanize the Hoklo people. By grouping their language, and by proxy the Hoklo people, in with mutually unintelligible languages on the mainland like Hainanese, and delegitimizing the stance of Taigi as a language, the KMT sought to completely erase it with Mandarin, or in Mandarin, Guoyu, in Taigi, Gouyi, and perhaps homogenize Taiwan under a single Chinese identity. Since the 1980s, when the KMT relinquished authoritarian control of Taiwan, Taigi has remained a prominent language of identity for Taiwan, even though it's not spoken universally. Taigi has been the preferred language of social movements since the mid-1980s for its connection to a single Taiwanese identity, but this notion itself is heavily contested, especially from Hakka speakers, who oppose this monopolization of Taigi as the sole language of identity for Taiwan. Salman Kari, who made this claim, also notes that in Taiwanese social movements, multilingualism is commonplace. This multilingualism often includes languages like Hakka and Austronesian languages. In response to the various independent movements that continue throughout Taiwan, Taigi films continue to top the box office. One common myth that Chi Hang-Su points out in his paper on Taigi cinema is the notion that Taigi film Dynasty ended in 1981. He shows that not only were Taigi films from White Terror era film producers being released as late as 1989, some of the top-grossing movies from Taiwan had been primarily spoken in Taigi. She names specifically Little Big Woman and Man in Love, 2020 and 2021 respectively. She argues these films are directly inspired by Taigi cinema period during the White Terror. Yet despite this support from social movements and linguistic maintenance from large films, the number of speakers of Taigi continues to fall, especially across generational lines. Young people are statistically way more likely to prefer Guoyu or Mandarin in their day-to-day lives. Despite policies that push for education in non-Mandarin languages like Taigi and Hakka, there continues to be a decline of speakers in these languages. Jess Paxton at Ole Miss suggests that while there's no clear consensus about why Taigi and Hokkien continue to decline in speaker populations, there may be several reasons. For one, it may be intimately connected to partisan politics. For another, it may be connected to neighborhood language preference, or it may be because of the way that these educational policies are implemented. Specifically, you take up 1 hour of Taigi Hakka or an Austronesian language in elementary school, and then nothing else throughout high school. To me, the most interesting suggestion from Paxton is that Taigi's lack of commonly used scripts, especially online, may contribute to its decline, especially in younger generations. While the Ministry of Education has released a Betweiji keyboard and a set of 2,000 characters for Taigi, it's still not a system language for Windows, macOS, or any Linux distribution. This means that you can't make your computer run in Taigi. For example, the Windows Start menu can't say Li Ho in Taigi. There's only Mandarin. Moreover, there's no official keyboards distributed by Windows, so Microsoft, Apple, and there's no translation in Google Translate from Google. This has long been the story with Chinese languages as a whole, including Cantonese, Hakka, and Shanghainese, all of which have their own orthographies. I suspect that because of the PRC's policy, the People's Republic of China's policy on non-Mandarin languages, i.e. dialects in their words, I suspect Microsoft and Apple are hesitant to provide ways to type non-Mandarin Chinese languages officially.
I saved this portion of the video because it's long enough that it could be a distracting tangent. I mentioned earlier that in the 19th century, Christian missionaries wrote a Romanized form of Taigi, which they then used to translate things like the Bible. This Romanization system was called Betweiji, literally meaning white speech characters. In 2007, the Taiwan Ministry of Education officially adopted a new system of Romanization called Taiwan Taigi Lomaji, which abbreviated is Tailo. It's mostly based on the old system of Betweiji, but with a couple initials changed and the vowel O dot being written as a double O. Taigi is also written with Chinese characters, modified to fit the language, including some borrowed solely for the purpose of phonetic sound rather than logographic meaning. The Taiwan Ministry of Education has approved about 2,000 of these for use in the Taiwanese language. Hanji are more popular than Betweiji or Tailo, but it's not uncommon to find Tailo on its own or alongside Hanji. According to Huang Lansu, acceptance of writing Tailo as the primary form of writing Taigi is at an all-time low. Instead, those who write Taigi tend to prefer Chinese characters. Written Taigi, although uncommon, is recognized as a national language by the Ministry of Education. Su discusses the ideological reasons for writing Taigi using Betweiji or Tailo instead of Chinese characters. She posits that many feel as though it's an anti-colonial act, and it reminds the writers of the history of the language, including the large period of time from 1895 to 1987, when the language and its people were persecuted. Moreover, it's a point of anti-Sinicization, that is, anti-Chineseness, a way to break away from the notion of being Chinese and to be simply Taiwanese and nothing else. Taiwan's political situation hinges on the big question, are we a part of China? As more and more Taiwanese people become disillusioned with the label Chinese, according to the National Zhengzhi University, decoupling themselves from a Chinese identity is a crucial part of their ideology. As I said, though, it's quite rare to see written Taigi in Taiwan, let alone Betweiji or Tailo, without Hanji accompanying it. Language revitalization efforts, however, spurred themselves from social movements, seek to resituate the language's role in Taiwan society. Taiwan President and Democratic People's Party leader Lai Ching-te continued to speak on camera, although not exclusively, in his native Taigi, challenging the KMT's former Mandarin-exclusive language policies, which I think is a good roadmap for how Taigi can survive in the future. The future of Taigi is an uncertain one. Speakership continues to decline, especially in younger speakers, and there remain no official keyboards for typing Peoizi or Taigi characters. Even though Taigi is regulated by the Taiwan Ministry of Education, and therefore institutionalized to some degree, without large-scale institutional support like government meetings or news and the like in Taigi, it will become at risk. I quite like that Cited is willing to speak Taigi to news outlets because it offers a window into what institutional support for the language can look like going forward, a governmental language. But it's important to note that we don't only promote institutional support for Taigi. We need more institutional support for Austronesian languages and Hakka too. This is very achievable. More newspapers, podcasts, and translated government documents into Hakka and Austronesian languages are very simple first steps. In the future, I hope to do another video talking about the phonology and morphosyntax of Taigi, which itself is actually pretty interesting. As an aside, it's from the Southern Mean languages as a whole that we actually borrowed the word T in English and de in Spanish. The word in Taigi is de, while in the Indo-Aryan languages, they borrowed the same word but from Mandarin, cha, which is now chai, which we eventually loaned into English as chai. Believe it or not, de and cha are actually two relexes of the same learned borrowing from Old Chinese. In the Whole 2 is a similar video about Javanese and its phonology, morphosyntax, and history. And hopefully further down the line are videos about some of my constructed languages, including classical Zespoel, Bumpanende, and Gatlaki.